What was the unluckiest lifepod in Subnautica? In this video, I'm going to investigate the story behind every single lifepod, putting them into a ranking from the easiest situation to the hardest. As you will soon discover, almost every single lifepod met a gruesome demise, either occurring from the technology malfunctioning or the local wildlife. So try putting yourself into their place and ask yourself, what lifepods do you think that you have a fair chance of surviving in? Lifepod 5 is undoubtedly the safest lifepod in Subnautica. It is inhabited by Ryley Robinson, the playable character, and is the only lifepod that is still floating above the water. In the intro cinematic, we can see the lifepod taking heavy internal damage, with one of the panels flying off and eventually hitting Ryley, knocking him out. When he wakes up hours later, his ship is on fire, with the decreasing oxygen levels probably waking him up. After that, we have the ability to construct a repair tool after going outside the lifepod and scavenging for a bit, allowing us to fix the secondary systems and radio. While some of the internal systems were damaged, the most fundamental ones, such as the fabricator and flotation devices, still worked perfectly, allowing us to not meet a fate similar to Lifepod 2 or 7. But what makes this lifepod so safe? Well, it's really the location we happen to land at. The safe shallows, as the name implies, is the least hostile location in the entire game. This coral reef has no predators, and is so shallow that oxygen tanks or diving equipment aren't even needed in order to harvest materials. And its safety is further supported by the fact that every single lifepod has been sunk by the local creatures, except for, of course, the playable characters.
Don't let them down, Captain. You need to evacuate. Negative. You'll need the ship in one piece.
Lifepod 19 is definitely one of the luckiest in Subnautica. Found 300 meters underwater, we can find the lifepod submerged in a tight trench at the deep, sparse reef. When we listen to the PDA entries, we can learn about the occupant's real identity, which was actually Second Officer Keen. Keen is effectively the second in command and was ordered by the captain to regroup with the survivors at his designated coordinates and use the crashed ship to contact HQ. This location is of course the floating island, where Keen eventually met up with Chief Technical Officer Yu. The pair then decided to swim towards the long-range comms aboard the Aurora, ultimately failing and dying to the Reaper Leviathans. While his story does end in misfortune, his landing location and circumstances are extremely fortunate. The deep, sparse reef he landed at is pretty void of life, especially at the water's surface. There are effectively no predators, and while his lifepod did eventually get sunk and breached, the occupant would have an ample amount of time to evacuate, and we cannot ignore the main advantage of his location. It is actually the closest lifepod to the floating island, almost being right on top of it. For survival alone, the island is pretty safe, with the only threat being the occasional flood and landslide. Any would-be survivor could utilize the abandoned habitats for basic shelter and the growing beds for emergency food. Out of every biome, except for the safe shallows of course, the floating islands is one of the most hospitable regions, allowing for long-term survival while removing the factor of unpredictable fauna.
That's not a distress flare! Stop waving it around like that, you'll catch the fuel line!
Lifepod 6 is one of the most preventable deaths in the entire game. The whole story honestly made me a little bit frustrated at how stupid people can be. We first hear about the lifepod through their distress signal, where a crew member notes that they have a passenger on board and cannot reach the rendezvous because of the radiation between them. When we listen to their first PDA entry, we hear the conversation between the Aurora crew member and the passenger. The passenger was completely freaking out, hoping that a rescue team would come for them, but the crew member reveals that they are all dead and that she is the head of human resources, so survival isn't her specialty. She suggests that they should look for lead to make some radiation suits, but the passenger makes it clear that she doesn't want to leave the safety of the lifepod. The crew member decides to go alone, but as revealed by the second PDA entry, when she returned, the passenger was waving a flare inside of the lifepod, eventually catching the fuel line and exploding the top of the craft, and presumably killing them both. Obviously, the flare wasn't intended to be lit fit in a small closed space or used to call for help. Its purpose is instead as an emergency lighting source for underwater caves. It's also interesting to note that the crew member did find a piece of lead, meaning they were already halfway done with the recipe for creating a radiation suit. But the grassy plateaus is actually one of the safest places they could have landed at. Not only are most of the creatures there harmless herbivores, but the wide open landscape makes it easy to spot any present dangers, such as the sand sharks and biters, which pale in comparison to the larger threats in other biomes. The occupants of Lifepod 6 would have had a much higher chance of survival compared to the other Lifepods, if it wasn't for the panicking passenger that blew them up.
You think there's something out there that's faster?
Oh, sure. And that's assuming it doesn't overload 3 meters from the Lifepod.
Lifepod 3 fortunately landed in one of the safest places on the entire planet, that being the kelp forest. Here, pretty much everything is harmless except for the stalkers and drooping stingers in caves, although they can be avoided. And this location has the strong advantage of having tons of useful materials just lying everywhere. But even with all of the present advantages, the crew weren't able to survive long after the crash. When we listen to their PDA entry, we find out that there were 2 separate crew members. Crew member 2 decided to try and modify a power cell and put it into their Sea Glide, hypothetically allowing for 2 times the strength and speed. This solution was most likely a last-ditch effort to save materials and pull both of them with just 1 Sea Glide. Despite the skepticism by crew member 1, they finally decided to use it, eventually leading to their death. It could have been by the stalkers catching them after it malfunctioned, but considering that the Lifepod has a huge implosion by one of the hatches, it's very likely that it suddenly blew up, taking the crew with it. Overall, surviving in Lifepod 3 would have been pretty easy. As long as you scan the area for stalkers before leaving the hatch, you're pretty much always safe from danger. Also, they didn't have to make the last-ditch effort of modifying the Sea Glide's battery, since one person could have just used it to rendezvous at the floating islands, getting help from the others.
The only thing I studied in medical school was how to lie convincingly.
Lifepod 12 can be found in the bulb zone 250 meters underwater. It has a noticeably large puncture on its side and is surrounded by deadly ampeels and bone sharks. When we read the PDA entry, we discover the story of Medical Officer Danby. He straight out admits that he isn't a real doctor, even though his ID says otherwise. During the exams, he used artificial intelligence to cheat, thinking that he doesn't need to know medical knowledge anyways when robots handle all of the injuries. All he is good for is reading out the diagnoses that computers generate for people. Before the entry, he probably went out exploring in the water, eventually getting bitten by a bone shark. This caused him to start bleeding out, and the Kara infection rapidly started growing on the medical officer. Ironically, the medical officer had no idea how to heal himself, and most likely succumbed to his injuries from the alien infection shortly after. It is also interesting to note how the huge opening from the Lifepod could have actually been caused by the warpers, who forced their way in to control the Kara infection. In all honesty, Lifepod 12 had a pretty unfortunate crash landing location. Deep biomes like these make survival extremely difficult, since it usually means large aggressive creatures, lower visibility, along with a hefty swim to get anything useful. When we consider that he has no actual medical knowledge, Danby actually serves as a good representation of a normal person, without any significant survival skills being put in this biome, where any small mistake can cause your death, making survival extremely difficult. Also, don't cheat on everything. You never know when some random knowledge can be useful.
I've tried everything. The analysis circuits on the fabricator are fried.
Lifepod 7 was put in an extremely unfortunate situation that they had no control over. The Lifepod can be found in the crag field. Here, the only real threat is the plethora of bone sharks swimming in every inch of this biome. But there is the huge advantage of having almost every material type on the ocean floor, plus some small herbivores to eat in order to stay alive. The biome doesn't sound too bad, but that wasn't the real difficulty that the victim faced. When we investigate the Lifepod, we can notice a bunch of non-essential equipment on the floor, and when we listen to the PDA entry, we discover what truly happens. It turns out that analysis circuits on his fabricator were fried, meaning that it interpreted its commands incorrectly. The crew member noted that when he wanted to make a battery, it ended up making a children's toy. When he wanted deep sea diving equipment, it gave him some lab tech, and it couldn't even be used for food either, as it would accidentally turn it into dust instead of cooking it like normal. He would then try to employ trial and error until he got something useful, which ended up fruitless, as we can only see more trash such as cups and hats on the floor. While his fate is not confirmed, it was most likely the bone sharks who eventually punctured the flotation devices and rammed their way inside. There is the high possibility that the crew member would have still been alive if his fabricator actually worked. The fact that he was shown to create this much junk shows that he wasn't incapable of survival, it was truly his equipment that failed him. Also, the crag field is a pretty deep biome, meaning that safely reaching the bottom where all of the materials would be is nearly impossible without an oxygen tank and rebreather. It was also one of the closest life pods to the floating island, which he honestly could have swam to without extra equipment. It is a shame that the crewmate probably died before receiving the order to meet there.
There are shadows in the water under the hatch, but I can't tell if they're rocks or aliens.
Lifepod 17 was so close to safety, but happened to land in one of the worst locations. When we find the Lifepod, it has obvious signs of forced entry. In his PDA entry, he reports seeing shadows in the water when looking through the hatch, noting that he does see some weird-looking caves around him. We can then notice the fragments of a sea moth directly next to the Lifepod, corroborating with what we heard from his distress signal. The crew member is revealed to be named Ozzy, a cafeteria worker who ran a cafe. After successfully ejecting from the Aurora ship and floating for a while, the fragments of the Seamoth Bay almost directly crashed into him, but narrowly missed. This probably led to damaging the flotation devices, causing the lifeboat to sink. But that's where their luck ran out, since they happened to sink right next to a tunnel leading directly into the Jelly Shroom Cave. The Jelly Shroom Cave is extremely dangerous, as that's the primary residence of crab snakes who ambush their prey. Because he landed so close to the entrance, the previously curious crab snakes probably started to attack the Lifepod, eventually prying it open through force. The crazy part about this story is the fact that if he landed only a few hundred meters in any direction, he probably would have been completely fine. Where he would be, avoiding the Seamoth Bay that crashed into him, would be far away from the entrance to the Jelly Shroom Cave, and being in one of the safest biomes in the entire game.
The oxygen's going to run out in 30 minutes and we're 500 meters down.
What do we do?
Lifepod 2 is one of the scariest scenarios in Subnautica. Found in the blood kelp zone, we can find the pod with a large breach on the side with gashes all over its flotation devices. When we listen to the PDA, we can discover that there were actually two inhabitants, that being Chief Technology Officer Yu and an engineer named Berkeley. After being launched from the ship and surviving the impact, Officer Yu reported that the flotation devices failed, flooding water inside their lifeboat. At first, they considered simply evacuating, but Technical Officer Yu used her skills to repurpose their oxygen system as a bilge pump, removing all of the flooding. But even after successfully surviving, they were now trapped in the lifepod 500 meters underwater, with only 30 minutes of oxygen remaining. Somehow, they scraped together enough material to build some equipment, and Officer Yu actually made it out of the lifepod safely, meeting at the rendezvous point atop the floating island. When we consider the huge hole in the lifepod and the fact that Berkeley didn't make it to the island with her, it is implied that he died by the local creatures, which include a ghost leviathan and crab squid. Lifepod 2 is definitely one of the hardest scenarios to survive in, because if it wasn't for the quick thinking of Officer Yu, the pair wouldn't have had any equipment at all, pretty much ensuring both of their demise directly after landing.
If you don't find me on board the ship, presume I miscalculated.
Lifepod 4 was pretty much in an unsurvivable situation. We can find the Lifepod incredibly close to the Aurora crash site, floating upside down. When we check out the PDA, we learn the last words of its previous occupant. The crew member says that his scanner identified a species with the designator Reaper, which we now know actually represents the Reaper Leviathan. One of the creatures tried to swallow his ship whole, probably creating these huge impact and scratch marks that can be found on the sides of the Lifepod. After feeling unsafe, the occupant then decided that the best course of action would be to try and take refuge in the Aurora crash site. The only obstacle was the Reapers guarding it. But luckily enough, he happened to have a data box with the schematic for a creature decoy, allowing him to make a couple with his limited resources. But as we soon realize, He never actually made it to the Aurora, since he cannot be found inside the ship. He either didn't have enough decoys to keep the Leviathans distracted, or was caught completely off guard and eaten. But either way, the location that Lifepod 4 fell in was incredibly dangerous. Almost immediately after the crash landing, he was already getting attacked by Reaper Leviathans, which we know will eventually crack it open. And even if the crewmate wanted to stay despite that, the heavy amounts of radiation coming out of the Aurora's eventual explosion would have taken him out anyways. The best course of action he could have chosen would be to swim towards the safe shallows where the player's lifepod is, or try and reach the floating islands. But considering how close the lifepod is to the Aurora, most crew members would instinctively try to reach it due to comfort and familiarity, even though it is technically one of the most dangerous places to go.
Life is a game which the universe plays with itself. I am done playing as this bundle of flesh.
Lifepod 13 is the only lifepod we can discover where its occupant died on impact. We first hear about the lifepod through a distress signal, where an automatic message relays its coordinates, noting that the lifepod is carrying a high-priority passenger that needs burial. When we investigate further and listen to the PDA entry, we can discover that the high-ranking official, named Yochi Kasar, was aboard the lifepod pretty much praying for his life while it detached from the Aurora. As they got further and further away from the ship, the lifepod's hull became damaged while it entered the atmosphere, eventually leading to a fatal collision with the water's surface. It is also important to note that only one of the flotation devices seemed to be functional, and almost every compartment is open and empty. This means that even if he somehow survived the initial blunt force of the impact, a situation similar to the player's lifepod might occur, where some stray objects ping-pong around the lifepod, eventually causing a mortal wound. But the biome he landed at is honestly pretty chill. Most of the creatures are completely harmless, except for the occasional bone shark. But the main issue, once again, is simply the great depth you have to swim in order to reach the ocean floor, where all of the raw materials are. And there is the possibility that a Reaper Leviathan from a neighboring region swam over and breached his lifepod, eating his body. So even though Yochi happened to land in a pretty relaxed area, simply because of the fact that he died on impact, Lifepod 13 would be one of the most dangerous lifepods to be inside of in the game. The worst fates in Subnautica were actually the ones we don't know about. The Aurora was confirmed to have launched pods 1 to 25 successfully, but you have probably noticed that there are only 10 life pods which are accounted for, leaving 15 different life pods out of the game with no explanation. But if we notice the context clues, we can realize that they all met a horrific fate. The first, and most likely theory, is that most of the life pods fell into the void. This region is highly dangerous, as it is where ghost leviathans frequent. While ghost leviathans technically eat microscopic organisms, they still attack any creature that happens to enter its territory. This means that any lifepod caught in the void zone would be slowly rammed and ripped apart as the ghost leviathan protects their land, giving its occupant no chance of survival. Plus, who knows what undiscovered creature also happens to live in the void zone. And we cannot forget that Reaper leviathans surround most of the biomes, especially the Aurora crash site, meaning that at least a few of the life pods were cracked open by them. But we also must consider the Aurora itself as a threat to the life pods. It is very possible that any craft in a close proximity to the initial explosion could have died along with it. Or it's possible that any flying debris from the ship could have completely crushed their escape pod, an extreme example of Lifepod 17. Needless to say, any poor soul who happened to enter those life pods had an instantaneous death at best, and a horrifying experience at worst. And that concludes this video. I haven't completely addressed it yet, but thank you for 100,000 subscribers. When I made this channel, I honestly never thought it would go this far, and I didn't expect all of the support you guys keep on providing. But stay tuned, as I will definitely cover some more Subnautica and Subnautica 2 content as it releases. And once again, thank you for watching.